Hey y'all, this is BG Codes and I am bradgarropy. In the previous video, I showed you how to set up Firestore in the Firebase UI. And in this video, I'm going to teach you how to integrate Firebase into a Next.js application. Let's get started. So just for reference, this is the Firestore collection of users that we created in the last video. We've got users with a name property and values like bradgarropy, Wes Boss, and Scott Tolinsky. As you see here, I have a generic create next app set up and running here. So that's what we're going to use as our starting point. So the very first thing we have to do is install the Firebase SDK. We'll do that by running npm install Firebase. Then let's create a utils folder and a firebase.js file so that we can initialize Firebase in the app. The first thing we're going to want to do here is import Firebase from the package that we just installed in the app directory. And secondly, because we want to hook up with Firestore, let's import Firebase/Firestore. This directory runs side effects that updates the Firebase object. Now, when we initialize, we have to pass it a configuration that uniquely identifies us. That configuration can be found in the Firebase UI. So if you start at firebase.google.com, click on Go to Console in the top right, then choose the project you're working in. In this case, it's Firebase Setup. And then click on this cog and go to Project Settings. Then scroll down. You'll see a section called Firebase SDK Snippet. This is where you get that information. You choose the Config Radio button, and you can grab this object and paste it into your code as the config. Now, some of you might be wondering, hey, isn't that private information? Should I not check that into my GitHub repository? I will say I put this into environment variables, but Firebase SDK is meant to be run directly from your front end or your web application. So this information is totally okay to commit to your repository and deliver to the browser. So now that we have this config, let's go ahead and call firebase.initializeApp with that config as an argument. However, we only want to initialize the Firebase application if there aren't any initialized yet. So let's wrap this in an if statement. And Firebase has this property called apps. And this is a list of all applications that have been initialized. And let's just make sure that the length is 0. And if the length is 0, then we can go ahead and initialize our application. And finally, because we're going to be interacting with Firestore, let's grab a reference to that database object and export it from the file. We'll define a variable called firestore, and we'll get that from Firebase by calling the Firestore method. And that is what we'll export as a named export from this function. Now, other parts of your application can use Firestore to interact with the database and do things like create, read, and update the users collection that we made. So let's start working on that. We'll make a users.js file in the utils directory, and we're going to use that Firestore function to access our users collection in the database. So we'll import Firestore from the neighboring Firebase file. And now we can create an arrow function called getUsers. Let's go ahead and export it now before we forget. This getUsers function is going to be asynchronous because it does have to reach out over the network to talk to Firestore. And so the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to take that Firestore object and we're going to call firestore.collection. And we are referring to the users collection that we created. And then we're going to run the get method. This takes a snapshot of all the documents in the collection at this time. So we'll save that to a variable called snapshot. And that is the asynchronous call, so we'll put an await in front of it. Now that we have the snapshot of the collection, inside of there, we can reference the documents. And for each of those documents, we can log it out just for simplicity's sake. And to access the data in a document, you have to say doc.data. So now we have this method called getUsers that we can use anywhere in our application to log out the users to the console, or if we change this around, to return them, whatever you'd like to do. So let's head over to the index page and maybe just get those users and print them out to the console on the page load. So the first thing we'll have to do is to import that getUsers method that we just defined. And this is from the utils directory in that users file. And let's do this in a use effect. So we'll import it from React here, and we'll just call the getUsers method inside of the use effect. This means that when the component home loads, we'll run that getUsers method, and our users from Firestore should be logged to the console. So let's go ahead and start up our dev server with npm run dev. It is running on localhost 3000. Here we are, and let's reload. And we have an error. Let's go fix it. I made a typo here. When we're iterating over docs, we should run the for each on an individual document. Let's go back here, refresh. Here we go. So every time the home page is loaded, the object prints out for each one of the documents. So you've got one for bradgarropy, one for Wes Boss, and one for Scott Talinsky. So in this video, I showed you how to integrate Firebase and Firestore into a Next.js application. I have 2 other videos out to show you how to do the same thing with Gatsby and create a React app. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.